Hi and welcome to my video of a lesson that I taught. What is occurring right now is their warm-up. Every day they enter the class and they have a warm-up question posted on the far side on that board. All it is a simple question reviewing what they did the day before. They're given 5 minutes. I'm not talking right now, I'm just giving them time to talk, and right about now we're going to start going over the question.
Alright guys, so the warm-up builds on what we went over yesterday. So who wants to give two examples? First, who wants to give two examples of physical features?
So right now, quite often, students will start to maybe be a bit shy, not really struggle, but just be a bit shy with their answers. And you kind of have to, well, I find that I kind of have to pull the answers out of the kids. So right now what I've done is I've asked that question and I'm not really getting too many answers. But in this next clip, you're going to see me kind of give them a little hint, and then it sparks that memory, and all of a sudden they all know what to do. So it's kind of a check for understanding and a recap all in one question. Here's this clip.
So we went over it yesterday. A physical feature would be something that is there. So what could that be? If you were to look that way, there's a massive physical feature. Mountains? Mountains, perfect.
So this is a really good example of what I was just talking about in the last segment, where students are a little bit shy, but as soon as I gave that hint of what was outside that window, a bunch of them say mountains, and that just sparks that little bit of a memory about what a physical feature is in this instance. So that's kind of just my opening. It's just a review of what we went over the previous day, but it also acts as a lead up for what I'm going to start next, which is the effect of these physical features on a climate.
So Barcelona's close to the ocean and its coast is far away from the ocean. So that means that they're getting different extremes in temperatures. So Barcelona's more mild because the ocean currents are changing the climate and the ocean's controlling how warm and cold it gets. Whereas in the middle of Russia, there's no ocean there and no water to control that temperature, so it can fluctuate all the way down to -50 in the winter, and then it can get up to 80 in the summer. Whereas in Barcelona, it'll be 80 in the summer and only just above freezing in the winter. So it stays in the middle, okay? So let's get onto that stream that we talked about across the Atlantic. Do you remember what it was called? Close. The Gulf Stream, alright? You guys know where I'm from, right? Where am I from? England, good. Everyone knows where England is on the map?
Yep.
Okay, so let's look at this map. Let's look at where the US is, and then let's look at where England is. Is England warm or cold?
It's warm.
Okay, so let's think about Canada. Is Canada cold?
Yes.
Right, and look where England is. In relation to Canada, how high is it? So you'd think England would be pretty cold. Colorado is a lot colder than England.
What?
Yeah? That's a little weird, yeah? Because, so let's think about the Gulf Stream. It starts in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico is, yeah, but what kind of temperatures do you get there? It's hot, it's warm, it's nice. And then this current, if you guys look in your book, it is on page 146. You guys can see the path that it follows across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's carrying warm air and warm water up towards Europe. So even though England's high on the map, it's mild. It's next to the ocean, and it's next to an ocean that's getting a warm current from the Gulf of Mexico. So that's kind of how oceans can have a huge impact on the country, because if it wasn't for that Gulf Stream and England's proximity to the ocean, it'd be really cold.
So the particular example that we just saw is continuing in the video now. It turns into a bit of a discussion about how the oceans are affecting it and how England would be much colder because of it, where it's located in the world. But that's just an example of teacher input, but teacher input's nothing if the students don't understand it. So next we're going to look at an example of where I'm checking my students for understanding of the topic and seeing how much of it they understand and where we can go with it next, and if we are ready to move on. So next we have a check for understanding. So here's my check for understanding clip. Right now what the students are doing is they are quickly reading over a one-page article in their book which is comparing Europe to Russia, so the continent of Europe to the almost country continent of Russia. And then in the next clip what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw it on one row, give me one similarity between Europe and Russia. This is clearly read in the article, but it just solidifies what has been read for both that row and the rest of the class.
Can this row give the class one thing that is specific to Europe?
Europe is smaller.
Europe is smaller, yeah. Let's talk about more of a physical geography, okay? More of a climate or a feature, okay? So, guys, climate or a feature?
They both have mountains. They both have mountains.
Alright, so they both have mountains. So here's one that we can put in the middle, okay? So there's one thing that each of them has.
So as you could probably tell, that check for understanding didn't go 100% as planned. The students could name similarities between Europe and Russia based on the reading, but they struggled a little bit naming the differences. But that's okay because that's what a check for understanding's for. So I learned from this that maybe going back through the article with these students immediately afterwards, which is what I did, but by going back through it with them, they were then able to pick up on the differences and not just what they each had, but what they only singularly had. So a check for understanding served its purpose in this case. Once the students understood this, it was then time to move on what you will see next, which is student practice. In the next clip, I'm going to be assigning a simple couple sentence to a paragraph description based on what we have just covered in the article and the previous work.
So we discussed Pueblo, we discussed the far side of the mountains, we discussed England, we discussed Canada and Russia and Barcelona. So there's a bunch of different places that you can discuss based on oceans and mountains, okay? So you guys are going to hand this in at the end. So you have 13 minutes. So just write a paragraph. I want 2 different regions, any of the ones that we spoke about, and then I want you to say how the oceans and the mountains affect these regions, okay? So pick one region that is affected by the ocean and one region that's affected by the mountains. And then we will wrap up in 11 minutes. So you have 11 minutes to do this.
So what I find good about this kind of assignment is that it's a good wrap up to a lesson. Just in a few sentences to a paragraph, the student is able to go through the effects of mountains, the effects of oceans, and they can choose between the 6 or 7 different regions and climates that we focused on. So in my opinion, this is a really good closing activity because it allows them to work individually. Any questions they have I can answer, and they get to recap on the whole lesson, which will then also tie in to the warm-up activity that they have the next day. The next thing that you're going to see is the feedback that I give on this activity that you just saw get assigned.
Everyone look at the objective, okay? The students will know how the oceans and mountains affect the climate. So I want one person to give me how the ocean affects the climate and one person to give how the mountains affect the climate, about how we discussed it. Okay? Yes. Nice and loud.
The Gulf of Mexico from the Gulf Stream to the northwestern side of Europe.
Good. Alright, so there's an ocean one. The Gulf Stream sends warm water up to Europe, keeping Europe not as cold as it would be if that Gulf Stream wasn't there. And then the mountains. We're in Pueblo. And what did we talk about Pueblo in regards to the mountains and how it affects climate? Pueblo's dry. Why? Because where does the rainfall go?
It goes somewhere else besides us.
It goes in the mountains. Good.
So that's an example of feedback that can be given at the end of the lesson. Feedback can be given throughout the lesson, but after an activity like this, where I try and make the students summarize what they've worked on for the whole class and wrap everything together, often the feedback that they get is positive because they've had a whole class to build this knowledge and information, and then at this point in time they have mastered it. So the feedback is good and kind of an explanation and an elaboration. And then finally we have the closure of the lesson and the finisher that sets them up for tomorrow.
The oceans can keep places more mild, whereas if you're in the middle of a continent, it can be very extreme. It can be hot and cold. But if you're next to the ocean, it's mild. And if you're next to the mountains, it can affect your agriculture and how much rainfall you get. On one side, you might get a lot of rainfall, and on the other side, you might get none or little to none, like Pueblo.